Mr. Sunak has prepped harder for this interview than any Indian politician I've ever seen. He knew his questions more than we knew them, and he prepped down to the T. Thank you very much. That's why they say he's a technocrat par excellence. Hopefully we'll get to see some of that side, and also some of what makes Mr. Sunak so special, and the fact that he's here means a lot to us. So thank you very much, Mr. Sunak, for joining us. Vishnu.
Thanks very much for spending some time with us. You have very deep links to this country, obviously, not just through Akshata, but your in-laws as well. Could you tell us a little bit about those linkages which have been so important for you in your life, and how you've balanced those with, being a British Prime Minister?
Well, first of all, good evening, and good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you all.
Mr. Sunak, I'm half convinced if you fight an election somewhere in India, there's a good chance you may win.
There's no danger of that, don't worry, Rahul. I'm perfectly happy in the UK Parliament. India means an enormous amount to me, but it also means a lot to the UK. I think our two countries are inextricably linked by ties of history, of culture, of family, and increasingly economically as well. But for me, my story, I'm of Indian heritage. My family came to the UK from India via East Africa, and I was raised by Hindu faith being a very important part of my upbringing. And that's why when I first became a member of Parliament, I took my oath of office on the Bhagavad Gita, and I always had in Downing Street, both as Chancellor and as Prime Minister, a little Ganesh on my desk in Downing Street. And even now when I'm back visiting my parents at home, I'll visit the mandir where I grew up. But you touched on it in your introduction. Then I also met my wife, Akshata, who is of course Indian. And even though she's South Indian and I'm Hindu Punjabi, so there was some learning to do on both sides. Although thankfully it's not as dramatic as that movie Two States, which I thought was, on reflection, a good thing. But I didn't know Bangalore. I mean, I came to India, but I didn't know Bangalore, which is a city that I now have a most close connection with through her, and of course my in-laws. And I think, at least I think
they're over here.
Yeah, they're somewhere here. I hope. There they are. There's I'm with my in-law. I don't know where my mother-in-law is if she's here.
Right behind Mr. Murthy.
Oh, she is. Both of them are there. There they are. And these two, obviously, then coming here as family rather than almost different when you're a tourist is very different. And they are both wonderful, not just grandparents to our two young girls. But you asked about the links politically. They were also very helpful in all my election campaigns. Because, well, they would come. They would put on my hoodies that we have with my name on it, and they would just go and knock on doors, deliver the leaflets, collect the voting intentions, and they've done that on all the elections, which has been very helpful. But actually, the most important thing that they have done for me is ensure that I fall in love with RCB. Yes. And that I think earlier this year, I was very fortunate to go to Ahmedabad with Akshata to see the IPL final. Isala Cup Namdu, I'll just put that on the record. So RCB fans here. But actually, I'll finish on this because that maybe this will be better. Yeah, I think actually being at that final really struck me because I went down to see the team afterwards and to celebrate. And actually, there were so many Brits there. So Phil Salt, Liam Livingston, playing in the team. Jacob Bethel had been there earlier in the year, and Mo Bobat is a director of cricket. And it demonstrated those close links between our two countries. But then also, if you think of British cars, you think Jaguar, you think Land Rover, of course, made in the UK, but now owned by a great Indian company in Tata. So it's a sign of the increasing bond between our two nations.
Can I just jump in for half a second? You were talking about your Indian roots. Is it true that you proposed to Akshata on a cliff in California in Kannada?
That is exactly true.
Okay.
Yeah. You're very well informed.
This is what you expect from a good Indian son-in-law, even though he's not fully Indian son-in-law, but he kind of, Indians feel that way. The moment you come to a public gathering, the first thing you say is tell your in-laws how wonderful they are. Rishi Sunak, full marks, 10 on 10 for striking just the right notes as we get started. Ladies and gentlemen, she'll be here on stage a little while from now, but can I request you to welcome the serving Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Harini Amarasuriya, who's just joined us. Ma'am, we are delighted to have you here. And we look forward to hearing from you later in the evening. Thank you. Padmaja, the perfect Indian son-in-law?
Absolutely. You know what they say, a family that praises its in-laws stays together and campaigns together. But I also have to ask, when you're watching an India versus England match, who are you cheering for then? Because that's a tough choice.
I'm obviously cheering for England, but have a very soft spot for India, as you can imagine. And that's why I get my fix through RCB. So that's my other great passion, as well as my home football teams. But I'm also actually, my constituency in England is in Yorkshire, which is probably the most cricket-mad part of the UK. And I'm very fortunate in that, because there is cricket everywhere in my life at home. And one of my favourite players, growing up, was Rahul Dravid, and trying to copy his brilliant technique. But Joe Root is obviously currently the best English batsman, scored more runs than anyone else, and he's a Yorkshire cricketer. So
but can I just ask you, sir, Bumrah or Anderson? Who would you pick?
So I was very fortunate to recommend to His Majesty the King that Jimmy Anderson should be awarded a knighthood. And we spent a lot of time, as I've just done.
But objectively, sir.
Sorry?
Objectively.
Objectively, his career over the 20 years that he has been in the England setup is genuinely inspiring. And having spent a bit of time with him, not only is his commitment and his work ethic inspiring, I think his humility is quite extraordinary for a top-tier sportsman, and that really struck me. He has a very special personal story, his background coming to the sport, and I'm delighted because we obviously, unsurprisingly, we celebrate batsmen a lot, but Bumrah is superb, but Jimmy Anderson, Sir Jimmy Anderson now, I think would have to be my pick.
I can go on with the cricket questions, but then...
I know, otherwise we can turn this into a cricket interview. You might want to talk about some geopolitics, I think, at some point.
Yeah, we're talking about the FTA, and it's been signed by India and the UK. We had the Prime Minister here last week, and that pretty much sealed the bonhomie. Where do you see the relationship between the two countries going next? Where does it go from here?
It was great to see the trade deal being signed, something that I started work on, and I'm really pleased that the new government concluded it, and the great couple of trips we've just had. Modi ji coming to the UK, the Prime Minister coming back here with a big business delegation, which was a great success. Now, I think trade, beyond the trade deal, there are two important things that trade deals signify in my mind, beyond the tariffs that are reduced here and the barriers reduced there. The first is, in a world that is becoming more protectionist, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit, actually countries like the UK and India signing a big, deep trade deal just sends a very positive signal to the world. And I think the second thing is, what it does is, it tells businesses, civil society, cultural organizations, academic institutions that the relationship matters. They are getting a signal from the leaders of their countries that this relationship matters to our governments. And then they will go off and find ways to strengthen it beyond the text of a trade deal. And I think that's what's so powerful about it. But look, I think there are areas we can build on. And one of the things that I first started speaking to Ajit Doval a few years ago was the Technology and Security Initiative. Which is a great opportunity for the UK and India to do more together. Whether it's the joint PhDs that the University of Manchester and IIS and Bangalore offer, whether it's in semiconductors, where you can combine UK R&D with Indian manufacturing prowess. That's quite powerful. Similarly, in biotechnology, the UK has strengths in vivo gene editing. India is an agricultural powerhouse. So, if you excuse the pun, there are opportunities for cross-pollination there too. And lastly, maybe in defense. And obviously, India has historically had a defense partnership with Russia. And I think that has diversified over time. And I think India rightly should want to have access to the best technology when it comes to defense equipment in the world. And I hope the UK can play a part as India looks to best-in-class suppliers. And I'm hopeful that can be an area of growth going forward too.
The last several decades were about globalization, about the world being one common trading bloc. Now we're seeing more and more trade barriers being created, especially given what President Trump is doing in the United States and the ripple effect this has on the global trade order. Given that, and now that you're not in power, you can actually look at it from a technocratic lens, What's your sense of how countries like India should be navigating the turbulence being caused by the kind of tariffs that the United States is throwing?
Yeah. No, look, it's an excellent point. I think I'd start by saying the old global order, the globalization that I grew up with, that came into place after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think that is gone, right? And I don't think it's coming back. Now, we're not quite clear what's going to replace it, but a couple of themes are clear. One is that there's going to be more multipolarity in the world, and India is an example of that. And I think the second is countries everywhere are focused much more on domestic capabilities. And the reason for that is twofold, and I think this is instructive not just for India, but for countries around the world. The first is COVID. COVID, although it was, of course, first and foremost a health crisis, was also an enormous geopolitical event because every country suddenly realized the fragility of their supply chains. I'll give you an example. We in the UK at the beginning were very short of PPE, gowns, gloves, masks, and it got to the point where the entire country was watching to see if a flight, I think it was taking off from Turkey to come to the UK, was going to land in time, with the amount of PPE we needed so our NHS could keep going that week. That was the where it got to. So because of that, every country in Europe now has a cabinet-level committee that's focused on the resilience of supply chains and domestic capabilities. I think that's the first reason, Rahul. Things have changed, and every country needs to think like that. And I think the second is China, right? And China, it's clear, doesn't play by the same rules that many of the rest of us were playing by, right? They don't view trade purely as an economic function, and it has meant that countries have to think about security, IP theft, alongside trading relationships. And that's why we went through a process in the UK, as did many other countries, of taking out Huawei equipment or banning it for future use and passing new national security acts, which mean that in sensitive sectors of our economy, we're a little bit more careful about who's investing, what are they doing, what technology is leaving our country. And as I said, those national security acts are new. Those cabinet committees focused on domestic resilience are new. They're not going away, and that's why I think the old global order, trading-wise, is not going to come back in the same form.
The United Kingdom is now in a post-Brexit reality. Obviously, there's a big part of re-establishing the United Kingdom economically and in other respects vis-a-vis Europe. But do tell us about your thoughts on that. But if I can also ask, hasn't your entire post-Brexit calculation also changed, because America looks at Europe fundamentally differently? It's not the same. The relationship has also changed. Therefore, has that impacted Britain's dynamics with Europe?
Yeah. Look, it's a really interesting question about Britain's role, especially post-Brexit. And I'm actually reminded of Prime Minister Modi ji's description of our role when he came to London some years ago, and he said, James Bond provides the entertainment and Brooke Bond invigorates us all. And if I think as Prime Minister, I probably didn't look as good as James Bond in a dinner jacket, but I certainly tried to reinvigorate our diplomatic relationships by drinking a lot of tea everywhere I went around the world. But I think you can see
many in the hall, though, who may think he came close, right?
Yeah.
By political standards, from what you expect from netas, that's quite sharpened up. Very sharpened
I'll take that, Rob. But actually, you're setting an example tonight, actually, which I'm not sure I can live up to. But thank you for saying that. Now, that nimbleness that you talk about is something that I think we have taken advantage of. And when I was Prime Minister, we took the UK into the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, which you'll be familiar with. That's the first big European nation to join that trade partnership. Similarly, I strengthened our ties from a defense and economic perspective with Japan and South Korea. You've seen the new Prime Minister, I'm pleased to say, actually continue to take advantage of that nimbleness, Vishnu, and that is the trade deal with India, probably the deepest trade deal that India has signed, the UK first kind of big country to do that in Europe, but also the trade deal that the UK has negotiated with the US, outside of the EU, having that flexibility to talk to the Americans and find actually a positive outcome relative to expectation and many others. And so I think that's important. Diplomatically, you talked about that, economic power is shifting east. And I think that's why it's important the Prime Minister was here. The bonhomie that you talked about is strong. We have good relationships with the Gulf states, which again are part of this multipolar world. And the other aspect of Britain's new role is technology, which I know we'll get to in a minute. But the UK has 4 of the world's 10 leading universities. It is the technology superpower in Europe. More venture capital in the UK than France and Germany combined. And Stanford do an index of countries on AI. The UK comes third behind the US and China. And we hosted the first AI summit under my leadership, and I'm pleased India is hosting the latest iteration of that series in February. But that was a summit that we created in the UK. It's been held in South Korea, France, and now India. I think so that speaks to the influence that UK can have in this post-Brexit world, whether it's on technology or on trade.
Do you think now we are, in essence, in a post-globalization era where we will see, and you've said this, that we will see far more changes and far more radical changes in less than a decade than we've seen in the last 25, 30 years?
Yeah. Now, we touched on the globalization part of that and why that's going to be different. But I think the big thing that is changing everything is AI. Now, technology has always changed everything, but there's something about AI which feels special and more radical. It's a general purpose technology, much like steam power, electricity, the internet. Every so often, these technologies come along which can transform how our entire society and economy operates, and AI is one of those. I think there are 2 things that we should bear in mind when we think about this transformation. One is the thing that actually all the AI leaders impressed upon me in Downing Street when they first came to see me 3 years ago, is they were struck by how fast the technology was advancing. And surprising even then. There's an organization in the US called Meta, which evaluates the progress of models. And it does it by looking at how much work the model can do, measured in time. How long a task can it do before it needs some intervention and help. And roughly that's about an hour at the moment. But I think the more striking thing is that time length horizon, or task length horizon it's called, that time has doubled every 7 months for about 5 years. So if that trajectory continues, before you know it, these models will be capable of replicating a month's worth of human work just like that. And that is, I think, one way I think about it. The other thing is the speed of adoption. In the past, it took a long time for technologies to spread through an economy, spread through a society. The telephone took maybe 70 years to get to 100 million people. Electricity took 50 years. PCs took 15 years. The internet took 7 years. ChatGPT, to get to 100 million users, took 2 months. And I think that is what is striking about the pace of change here, how quickly this new technology is being adopted around the world, and just how transformative it is likely to be in the very short future.
While Mr. Sunak was in power, he was organizing conferences on different developments and trends in AI. He's now advising companies like Anthropic on how to keep up with regulation, how tech is changing, and I'm very curious, given the speed at which AI technology is advancing, Mr. Sunak, your thoughts on how countries like India and the world in general should be looking at regulating artificial intelligence, because by the time people in government even understand what is happening, the technology is leapfrog much further.
Yeah, and I think there's an excellent question, which I thought about in government. Every government is thinking about it, and actually it goes to your earlier point about how does the UK position itself. Outside of the EU, one of the freedoms the UK has is on regulatory flexibility. And I made the decision, which I'm pleased the new government has continued with, not to introduce new regulation on AI. So that's what the EU has done and other places have done. I thought that was the wrong thing to do, Rahul, for precisely the reason you said. This technology is moving so quickly at the moment. My bias is towards innovation, because I want to make sure that we can get all the benefits from it that we know are there to help our societies in health and education and productivity. And if we start regulating it before we even know how it's going to operate, I think we're going to crimp growth. And that is what lots of companies would tell you is happening in the EU. Now, that said, I do think it's important for governments to ensure the security of their citizens. And I think we do know that AI in the wrong hands can be used for bad ends. And that's what I did in the UK, is to create a new AI security institute, which has the technical expertise, working with our intelligence services and related bodies to evaluate these models to make sure that we understand what security risks they pose so that we can then, if we need, take corrective action. And I think that is the right place for government intervention at this moment to be. It's to be pro-innovation, encourage the adoption of these technologies, have a mind towards the security risks and develop the expertise to deal with them in the same way we would with everything else. And things like cyber risk or bioterrorism are things that we need to be aware of and protect our citizens against and make sure we are ahead of the game when it comes to AI. But outside of that, my bias would be in favor of innovation, which is I'm pleased what the UK is doing.
India is the fastest growing large economy in the world. Do you believe that India's success globally, India's importance globally is directly linked to our economic status?
Yeah, India clearly is an economic superpower. If you think about it, in the last few decades, it's tripled its share of global GDP, which itself is an extraordinary thing to say. But I'll give you maybe a different example of illustrating the power, which talks to the economics, but also broadly. For the first time in about 100 years, in 2028, cricket is going to be an Olympic sport again. Right? Now, that is purely and simply because of India's new power and status in the world. Now, of course, there's an economic aspect to that because the broadcast rights are economically important to the IOC and the value in India will be higher if cricket is included. But it also, I think, speaks to the fact that if you've got 1.4 billion people becoming more economically, culturally, geopolitically significant, their desires, their needs, their wants are going to get recognition in the world. And I think cricket is a great example of that. But more broadly, look, of course, the economy is growing very fast. We talked about some of the things that are special about it. But I think when I look at economic growth going forward, a couple of things stand out to me: energy and technology. We talked about AI, and India is very well placed in AI, but AI is an energy-hungry innovation. You need energy to power these data centers, which is why the energy plan that is in place in India, I think, is so important. And then if you look at that Stanford index that I mentioned that ranks all those countries, I was very proud to say the UK is third, but very close, just behind us, catching up very quickly, India is fourth. And as Prime Minister Modi ji always used to remind me, India also just about overtook the UK with the number of unicorns that were created. And that is a sign of, I think, the technical capability of the population here. Actually, Dario Modi, who's the founder of Anthropic, the company that I provide some advice for, was recently in India just a few days ago, and he was completely struck by the talent of the young entrepreneurs working on applications for AI to make sure that they have an impact here in India. So I think, look, there's a very exciting future economically, but I think it goes broader than that, and I think cricket is a good example.
Speaking of cricket, we have the former Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Tony Abbott, with us here. We've got the Sri Lankan Prime Minister, Harini Amarasuriya. We'll have the Indian Prime Minister. Maybe we can just do a toss-up and hopefully figure out at least till the semi-finals where we get to in 2028. And after that, then we can decide. You'd all guess. Otherwise, essentially, we're rooting for India. Australia, Mr. Abbott, is a little tougher. So is England. But the Sri Lankan Prime Minister is our guest. Anyway, as long as India is in the final, we'll take on any of these countries. Padmaja.
Well, Tony and I have the Ashes to worry about in a couple of months' time. So.
Yeah, and all that aggression on the cricket field that we see from India, from all the countries, in fact, we're looking also at a very aggressive phase of trade. You spoke of how trade is the new currency now, and in a very transactional, aggressive form of trade that we are seeing internationally. How do you evaluate the stand that India has taken vis-a-vis trade, tariff? How do you look at India's stand?
Look, I think...
And especially keeping in mind the way our economy is growing, the way we have pushed our economy and put it on the fast track.
Well, look, I think every country is going to work in its own national interests, right? And that is entirely right and what one would expect. And I think actually in the world that is, as you say, becoming more protectionist, India signing a big trade deal with the UK is an incredible positive sign of India's willingness to sit down with countries, find common ground, and then create contracts that are going to be mutually beneficial and give all the signaling benefits that I talked about before. And I'm sure India will look for other opportunities to do that and is talking to the EU at the moment. The UK is also talking to countries. So I think that will happen because other countries are keen to make sure that they keep trading with each other. But you said something very interesting about transaction-based politics, and I think that is a shame, because if you approach these relationships, my personal experience is you will get less out of these relationships if they are both purely on transactional ways, and everyone is just going into the relationship thinking, what do I get in the here and now for me?
But that's the new reality with Donald Trump in the White House.
Yeah, and look, and everyone will react to it in a different way. My experience is, in life as in politics, I think when you can build relationships based on trust, I actually think they can over time be more powerful. And I found that in my job. I was struck, forming a relationship with the EU President, Ursula von der Leyen, who I didn't know until I got the job as Prime Minister, and she didn't know me, but we formed what I think is a close bond of trust between us. And because we had trust, we were able, in a very private way, with a small team, without any leaks or distraction, really work through some very difficult issues about the UK's post-Brexit relationship with the EU, especially as it concerned Northern Ireland, which is a special part of our country. And that trust is what enabled the two of us to find something that was mutually agreeable, that everyone thought was impossible to solve. And so my reflection on it is that where you can build relationships with trust, in the long run, I think they will actually be far more powerful.
Since you referred to cricket, in cricketing parlance, you were sent in when your team was facing a follow-on type situation. That's when you were sent in to bat as Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. In your own imagination, how actively do you harbor the idea of coming back to 10 Downing Street?
No, you're right. Look, the circumstances when I became Prime Minister were not straightforward. I mean, there'd been a run on the pound. I think my party was about 28 points behind in the polls at that point. Inflation was at a 40-year high, and I was the third Prime Minister in a matter of months. So I think you could say it wasn't the easiest. It wasn't the easiest of innings to walk out to, in your terms, Rahul. But look, my priority. We talked back to my faith earlier. We all have our dharma to do, right? And I drew my strength from the Gita at that time. I was like, look, I have a duty to do. I want to serve my country. I think I'm well placed to make a difference at this moment, and especially on the economy. That was the thing I was there to resolve, and that's what I put my energy and focus to. And it wasn't easy, and you have to make lots of decisions that aren't politically necessarily popular, but they will bring inflation down, and that's what we did. And when I left office, inflation was back at 2%, having been in double digits. The economy was growing well. Our borrowing and debt were all under control. So on the key task of stabilizing our economy, I'm proud of what we achieved. And as I said, circumstances were difficult, but in those, you have to just do your best. And as my mother-in-law would tell me, you do your level best, and the rest is left to God, and it will be what it will be.
Who gives you more advice between the father-in-law and the mother-in-law? Where do you get the more relevant and useful advice from?
Certainly, the same. You don't pick between your children. You certainly don't pick between your in-laws.
Narayan is nodding and saying, "Yeah, good answer."
No, I mean, I get different advice from the two of them. It's probably worth spending a second on. And I'm very fortunate to get both their advice. Actually, from my father-in-law, he was very instrumental in me actually entering politics. And I was motivated by public service, but I also thought, well, look, you can have a successful career in the private sector, and that is also a way to impact people positively. And actually, he said to me that I should go and enter politics and hopefully serve in government. Yeah, and I thought, because his view was that was the best way to make a positive difference to my country. And I thought that was very striking, because here's someone who not only has founded an incredibly successful company that employs thousands and thousands of people, it's created a whole new industry. It changed how India was perceived on the global stage, and he did it in a particular way. And even he was saying that he thought I could go into government and make a bigger difference. So that was very inspiring to me. The other thing he said, which was a very good lodestar for me, was, in politics you often wonder, what do I aim for? Is it popularity? Is it to be loved? Is it to be feared? And you try and think, what am I aiming for? And in the same way that he organized his life, the thing that I took from him was to aim to be respected. And whether you're a corporate leader or a political leader, I think that's a great anchor to have, is aim for people's respect. It doesn't mean they're going to always agree with you, and you accept that. But if you're trying to be respected, it will lead to all the behaviors that I think will make you successful, and you'll look back with pride. So that's what I got from him. But my mother-in-law, what I learned from her was just an extraordinary compassion and empathy. And my wife has it as my mother-in-law has it, and that she has showed me how just being in touch with that compassion and that empathy with everyone can become a very fulfilling part of your life. Akshata and me have just set up a charity to focus on education in the UK, and inspired by the work that she has done here in India. And that will always stay with me. And that has, I think, rounded me out as a human being. But also when I see her communicate, and you talk about winning elections and things, I often think, the way that she can connect with people from every walk of life, whatever their background, in her way and with her authenticity, I think is extraordinary. And that is something that you can only watch and marvel at. I don't think it's something that I can necessarily learn from, although I wish I could.
Sir, you've been labeled as an anti-immigrant. Now, it's one thing to have a problem with illegal immigration, but there are so many around the world, not least of all in India, who aspire to be legal immigrants in the United Kingdom, enter the United Kingdom as students, and then perhaps get an opportunity of being there either on a skilled worker visa or initially on a graduate worker visa. If the United Kingdom doesn't give the same opportunities that have once existed, then I would suggest that your universities would be poorer, because the UK wouldn't be perhaps number one as a choice for Indian students.
So look, on the issue of migration, you're right. Look, I come from a family of immigrants, and I'm very proud that the UK is a multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy, and I'm living proof of that. But I think, look, we have to separate on migration. There are two very clear policy areas that require focus, particularly in the UK. The first is the issue of illegal migration. And we've had an issue of people coming to our country illegally, and that's not acceptable. I mean, obviously from a very practical issue of security, it should be for the government who decides who comes to your own country. But also, as I said, it's just fundamental to our sovereignty, to any nation's sovereignty, that the people of that country decide who is coming. And that's why this issue of illegal migration is so important. And I set out a bunch of measures to tackle it, which at the time felt radical, but I'm pleased now many countries in Europe have said the same things that I said back then about changing some of our outdated international frameworks to help us deal with this problem and send people away if they come illegally. So that's the first part. And look, on the topic of legal migration, what happened after COVID is the numbers in the UK really soared much higher than anyone expected or was appropriate. And that's why I took strong action to start bringing them down, which they are now doing. And I think it's important that is seen through and seen through to completion. Alongside that, of course, the UK and every country wants to be a beacon for the world's most talented people to come and help contribute economically, to help grow the economy. And I'm struck. You see the success of the Indian diaspora all around the world, particularly though in technology and entrepreneurial companies. The UK, I think, like the US, I think there are some studies which show almost half of the fastest growing, particularly tech businesses, are founded by immigrants. And I think that's an important thing for us to keep in the back of our heads as we think about driving future growth and making sure that we are always a beacon for the world's most talented, skilled people who are willing to come and contribute economically, but I think crucially also integrate into society. Because what we can't have is people living separate lives. It's important that there's integration and some common bonds.
Because, you took a very strong stand on immigration. On that topic, did you find the spotlight then turned on you? Personally, how did you then strike the balance? Because you've been also very open and vocal about your immigrant roots. We had you lighting a diya. We also had you doing Gau Puja in UK. And then you're taking a very strong stand on immigration. How did you strike that balance?
Yeah. Look, I think you put it very well, actually, about the things that were going on in my mind. I should repeat what I said before. The UK, I'm proud, is a multi-faith, multi-ethnic democracy. And in fact, when I became Prime Minister, first non-white Prime Minister, first Hindu Prime Minister, in a sense that was a remarkable thing. But actually, what was more remarkable was that no one made a particularly big deal of it. And I think that spoke to that multi-faith, multi-ethnic tolerance that I've touched on. And, I took the action I did on migration because I think it's important. I think it's because I come from a family of migrants that this issue of illegal migration really offends me because, Britain is built as a country where fairness is important to us, rules is important to us. We stand in queues when no one else does, and that's, who we are as a people. So when people jump the queue and come to our country illegally, it undermines that tolerance that I think is at the heart of our society's fabric. But look, I made a commitment to myself when I entered into politics. I wasn't going to change who I was. And I was comfortable with that, and Akshay and I talked about it. So that's why, I was happy lighting the Diwali diyas in Downing Street and painting Rangoli. And actually later that night, with the bit that no one saw, which was nice, and the cameras didn't film it, we did sparklers with our two daughters on the street. And I was never going to change who I was. Because of politics. I made that commitment to myself. And so, for me, in a sense, it wasn't a balance. That was just something that was non-negotiable to me.
I asked Mr. Sunak as he was walking in, how has this trip to India been? Amongst the various things he said he's been Diwali shopping, like many of you, I'm sure. So what does Diwali shopping in Delhi look like, Sunak sir?
Well, I was at Khan Market this morning, which was good. But actually, probably for me, the more important thing is the mithai. So we were talking about this earlier, but I was very lucky because I had dinner with my in-laws last night, and then I said to my mother-in-law, we'll get something sweet, which we didn't have at home. So she straight away said we were going to the Bengali sweet market. And so off we went to her friend who runs that, and then I've stuffed my face with kulfi all night long. I have got more.
No Mysore Park for you?
Sorry?
Mysore Park?
Actually, there was no Mysore Park there last night, actually, was there? But then I have my jalebis and burfi with me now to take home, which I better check on the whole customs procedures about that. But otherwise I have to eat them before I get on the plane. So for me, the Diwali shopping is mithai first, and then, all the other bits second.
I don't know what Mr. Murthy is going to make of this. I know he said that keep me away from the limelight, but Mr. and Mrs. Murthy, you've been just such an integral part of this conversation, and we'll be very amiss if we didn't bring the mic to you just for a moment, because we've heard so much about what Mr. Sunak thinks about his in-laws, and given that you, Mr. Murthy, nudged Mr. Sunak towards politics, I'm very curious to ask you why you wanted Rishi, your son-in-law, to work towards public office and be in politics. How did that happen? And what do you make of his very distinguished career, being the first person of Indian origin to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? What do you make of it, Mr. Murthy? Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a very warm of applause for Mr. Narayan Murthy?
He is intelligent. He was highly accomplished in his work. He is a man of integrity, man of principles. We have seen so many transactions that brought these things out. So therefore, he is a wonderful example of somebody that should be in politics at this point of time in the world.
Mrs. Murthy seems very inspired by you as well, very clear instructions like in all your textbooks to your son-in-law. Who listens more to you, Sudhaji? Your daughter listens to you more or your son-in-law?
Well, both, I think. So I call Rishi as my new son. I've dedicated a book to you, Rishi, my new son.
That's absolutely
But
fantastic.
Rishi listens to me more, I think. Between the two.
Rishi listens. I wonder what Akshata would say when she listens to this. I'm sure she's
Thankfully, she's not here, so that's good.
But we have to ask you this, since your father-in-law had nudged you into politics, what next? Is it going to be PM Sunak or Professor Sunak?
Well, my parents were unhappy I was not Dr. Sunak, so I think they would be much happier with Professor Sunak next if there was an option. But no, look, I want to keep being useful and productive, and what I hope is I can draw on my experience in government, my experience of business and technology to keep making a contribution to some of the things that we've been talking about. Actually, your questions covered the whole range of issues that leaders are grappling with here in Europe, everywhere else, and I hope I can draw on my experience to make a constructive contribution to how do we tackle some of those challenges to move our countries and societies forward. And I've gone back to do public policy work at Oxford University and Stanford University, both of where I studied. And I have to say, it's much better being at university when you don't have exams. So I'm enjoying that incredibly. But actually, I'm getting to spend a lot more time at home in North Yorkshire watching cricket. But actually, the thing I haven't really mentioned, the thing I'm loving more than anything, is spending time with our two young daughters, who I've missed seeing much over the last 5 years. But actually now, getting time with them, it's a real joy. So, long may that continue until they get bored of me and want to go off and become teenagers. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a very warm round of applause for Mr. Rishi Sunak? I said earlier that he said, I didn't make much of the fact that I was of Hindu origin and that was my faith, and despite that I became a Prime Minister. But I think a lot was made here in India, and just the fact that someone like you went on to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom just says a lot to the kind of country the UK is at the moment. A melting pot truly in every global sense. We thank you very much. We've been absolutely delighted to have you, but I do hope when the Olympics happen in Los Angeles, it's India that wins, and maybe you'll be cheering for India as well, especially if it's against Australia, Mr. Abbott.
England-India final, and we'll beat the Aussies in the semis. How about that?
Woo! Look forward to that. Thank you very much. I'm sure Mr. Abbott's cheering for another seat, but that's fine. As long as India is winning, we're all fine. Thank you very much, Mr. Sunak, for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.